Okay, let's do a lesson that I used to teach in my follow-up lesson to Stampscaping 101. I think I called it Stampscaping 101B or something like that. I do consider this a beginning exercise, and it's really easy, and it's just utilizing your color schemes for a little bit more of a strategic approach to depth within a scene. In my first class, I used to teach people how to just, grab their pads of whatever kind of color scheme they were working in and just lay them out from light to dark. So in the case of blues, if we're working with mementos, we'd have light blue, medium blue, and a darker blue. This could be in any kind of color scheme that you want. You can mix and match pads too. But if I was to do some kind of color scheme like this one right here, I don't know what you would call this. It's kind of browns with a little bit of a twist with the orange and sweet plum in here. We can incorporate something like a Distress Ink tea dye in here, and it would kind of relate. But this type of color scheme can be utilized for not only coloring a scene, but to stamp your imagery out that you're going to use in a scene for strategic effects in terms of that depth. Meaning that the lighter colors within your color scheme, coloring scheme, would represent things that are farther off in the distance. The medium tone ones might represent your midgrounds, and the darker tones could represent your foreground. Okay, but it's not just like, something that's so straightforward. I mean, you don't have to have imagery stamped in these different tones. We can utilize two of them or something like that, or even just one. For example, if I stamp out a kind of nighttime or winter type of scene, just going with a blue-toned range like this, value range. I could just stamp this out in, a dark blue, and I could stamp out, I don't know, some clouds in the distance in that same dark blue or something like that, and utilize my black ink for things in the foreground, so it doesn't mean that you have to stamp out everything, within this kind of value range, representing something so far back to the front. Okay, that's kind of confusing there, so let me show you in practice what I'm talking about here. Okay, so I'm going to stamp out this composition here using the Lakeside cabin. I'll put the tall rock in the background. It's something very distant. And then we'll have some Shimmering, that's the name of the stamp right here, in the foreground right here. And then we'll also use some other types of imagery. I'm thinking about this oak branch here in the foreground. I could use it kind of at the base here as like a bush and as an overhang for the like a tree limb or something like that. So this can be utilized both ways here. Okay, all right, so that being said, what we have here is something very distant. I mean, if I had a cloud or something like that, it could be even farther back in the distance, but this one will represent background. This one will represent kind of our midground image. And then our foreground image will be this oak branch. It'll be the thing that's closest to us. Now I also have this Fisherman. I'm not quite sure if I'll use them or not. We'll see what we have room for in this composition. I'm just going to be working on a quarter-page card, so maybe this tall rock could be kind of hanging off the top of the scene. And I can put this in here, about, I don't know, I'd say about 2/3 of the way up, talking about rule of thirds if you know anything about that. This will be down here, some bushes right here in the foreground. I don't know, we'll see how it goes. But, okay, what do I stamp this image out in? I would say that for the most part, this image, it's kind of our main image, and it's going to be the one that we're going to be working around. So I typically would stamp that type of image first. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose, maybe, I usually don't go too light for my main image because I really want there to be enough contrast in that main image. So I think I'll go with the rich cocoa, okay? It looks fairly dark right here, but when I stamp it out, I don't know, the Memento inks, I find that they stamp a little bit lighter than the indexing for the most part, but anyways, let's try that. I really love the look of this type of exercise when it all comes together, but it'll look kind of weird when we first stamp it out. It's only through the blending of those same colors that you use to stamp out your imagery, and where everything kind of comes together, and you do have to work through the entire range of those colors for everything to kind of make sense. Okay, so see what I mean? This is quite a bit lighter, I feel, than the ink. So, fairly light. And let's go, I don't know, this Potter's Clay, let's see what color that stamps out to look. I tell you what, instead of just going with this as a whole like this, I think I'll go like this, and to each side, so it kind of creates this canyon where I can have some light kind of streaming through here. So I'll just utilize this portion and this portion. But let's do it in orange. That's going to look really weird here. But you'll see how it all comes together in the end result. I haven't used this color scheme at all before, but we'll see how it goes. It should work out. This usually works out with any kind of color scheme that you're working in. Okay, so this one right here, I'm going to blot this edge a little bit so that it stamps out a little bit lighter. So hopefully it'll look like the light is kind of hitting it. And I'll wipe off the bottom of this. If you've seen some of my other videos, if I'm stamping something behind something that's going to transition into it, oftentimes I wipe off the bottom of it so that it stamps out lighter. I didn't always used to do this, but I'd be using so much white pigment ink to make something lighter, and I thought, well, why don't I just not, you know, stamp it out so dark to begin with, okay? Alright, so let's go like this. I'm using, I don't know, I'd say about half of it, and then some of it has been wiped off. Not completely, but just lightly so that it transitions from kind of a wetter impression to a lighter one, drier. Drier means lighter when it comes to our inks like that, okay? See that? Where it's a little bit darker over here and it's a little bit lighter over here and down here. And I made it kind of lighter down here so that as it transitions into here, I still see a nice silhouette of my trees. Maybe it'll be more apparent when I do this, okay? So I'll utilize about maybe a quarter of the stamp. One of the nice things about scenic stamping is that you can always utilize smaller portions of your stamps, and it makes complete sense, okay? Because in nature, you know, you can use bits and pieces of things and it looks just fine, where in other types of stamping it might look strange to only have like half an image or something like this, but scenic stamping, you're talking about components and textures and just utilize things, portions of things for, you know, for what you want, okay? So you can see where that kind of transitions from dark to light down here. So not only am I using just portions of my stamp for what I want, but I can stamp out portions of the stamp darker or lighter to get a little bit more variation in here. Okay, so anyway, that is that right there. Let's go ahead and use some of this. Now, on this one right here, it is going closer to us, so I can stamp this out in Memento or something like this, the rich cocoa, or I can use the Potter's Clay again. I'm thinking that water tends to reflect a lot of the colors of the sky, so I think I'm going to, if I have these types of colors reflecting off of that mountain, I'm saying that that's the color of light that's hitting it, so it's kind of this warm light in there. And I'm just going to use that same warm light down here in the water. Even though this water represents something a little bit closer to us, it is still reflecting the colors of the sky, so I'm just going to go with something like this. I'm just going for a little bit of texture, okay? Like about like so, so that'll kind of create these nice kind of striations across the water's surface, okay? So we have a darker image and a lighter image in value, okay? Near, far. And if I wanted to, I could put some clouds back in there in the distance or something like that. Maybe I do it in an even lighter tone. I don't know. But, okay, so what I've done here is I've created this situation of reflected light as opposed to just stamping all of this out in black, which is another way to do this, okay? We could stamp out our main images in just black tones and then color it in. But, again, this is just kind of a strategic way to use color for a different look, and I think it kind of has a little bit more of an emotional feel to it. Okay, so I didn't forget about my foreground here. Okay, we're going to have these bushes in here, but I'm going to stamp that in black, and I'm going to use this Memories black right here. That being said, I feel that coloring this in first before I get to my foreground kind of is a little more effective sometimes in kind of achieving a nice dark rich impression. Okay, if I stamp this right here and I kind of blend over it, sometimes it tends to smear a little bit, especially if I'm using a very thick ink. Alright, so toning in. Okay, I want these, all of my techniques and everything like that to be very accessible to people. So I have I need to still unpack from my demo experiences at the last two conventions, but I'm just going to use a dry paper towel here. It's just a dry paper towel to do my inking in here, okay? I usually use Colorbox stylus tools, but those are going to be in short supply unless they are already in your collection, because ClearSnap has gone out of business, and unless someone else picks up the tooling and things like that and starts making it, I have no idea what happened to all that equipment from, you know, ClearSnap. But anyway, okay, so here's our color scheme that we're going to be working through. I'm going to throw that Distress ink in there. That one's tea dye. And I'm going to start off with that. The tea dye, I believe, is the lightest of all these different hues and values in here, so I'm going to start with that one. If you can't tell which one's darker than the other one, then it's not going to matter. They're close enough to where you can use either one. Okay, so I'm going to create a situation on this lake. Okay, it's almost like finger painting, where I have some light coming through here. This is going to be my lighting scheme. It's going to be lighter in here, and there's going to be a reflection of light down here. Okay? So if there's going to be a reflection of light down there, I need to make some areas that are a little bit darker around it, because we're not working with light per se. We're just doing the depiction of light, right? It's the illusion of light. We're not using, you know, light bulbs in the back of our scene, you know, back here. Okay, so in order to create light, we need contrast. Okay, so you can see right down here in the water where I'm bringing in this tone like this. Okay, you see where that's kind of bringing that area out down here. This is a very light color, okay? So we're not creating a lot of contrast, but that's good because we have a lot of control over this process right here. Let's tone in these large rock structures, these mountains right here. Okay. So by doing that, we're creating kind of a lighter passage right in here. But I don't want to have it just completely light in that space there, so I'm going to bring in some of this tone and to bring it across in each direction. It kind of creates these striations up there, and I'll do the same thing down here in the water. Don't eradicate, you know, your light down here, but I like these kind of horizontal bands coming across here to, you know, reflect, you know, that banding that you would see on the water's surface, as well as up in the sky. The areas that you kind of retain your light like that, it kind of creates this cloud up there. Okay, now let's talk about this cabin right here. We're going monochromatic here, so I can just come in here like this, and I can put a little tone on my cabin, but I'm going to be careful about this cabin, and especially the rooftop here when I move into my darker tones, because this is going to be top lit, and just like these pads right here that are just white right here and white down here, you can see that if I change the angle of this like that, I have light coming in from all sides of my desk right here for these videos, but you know, the top surface of this white is lighter than the the vertical surface, right? It's because the light is hitting it from this direction here. So that's the same thing, type of thing you're doing like that. So anytime you're doing any type of structures, I would recommend, you know, coloring the sides a little bit darker, unless you have it front lit or something like that, or, you know, bottom lit for some, you know, particular reason. But see, doing that right there, it kind of creates this more three-dimensional feel to that cabin. Okay. With my first colors, I do tend to like to utilize that to not only color, but kind of saturate the page, the cardstock. If you kind of add a lot of this tone down, it makes it easier to blend in your darker tones that are coming right on top of it, right? Because the surface is a little bit more moist, right? And if it's kind of a little bit wetter, I mean, this is not wet to the touch right here, but I am kind of making the surface a little bit more damp. So that's one of those things that I'm always trying to get across, and that's one of those things that people don't typically do at first because they're used to coloring, so once everything is kind of colored with a certain color, they stop. And that's what you do, you know, to most types of you know, coloring situations, but here it's a little bit different. You're kind of glazing and you're almost kind of lubricating the page for other colors to come afterwards, okay? Alright, now, that was tea dye, and I think that's as dark as I'm going to get there. It's pretty fully saturated, but you can kind of see my lighting scheme already, and that's just using one color. So it's really coming together pretty fast. Okay, this is Desert Sand. I'm just going to use the same ink right here, or I don't know, not ink, but ink applicator, you know, just in my little sponge here. Alright, the Desert Sand, I think, is warming the scene up a little bit. It's very subtle. I can tell right here, looking at it. I don't know if you can tell on camera. It's a little bit yellower, yellowy, warmer in temperature. I add some more on my mountain. Like this. Okay. Some of my cabin. This is still a very light color, so I don't have to be too careful about my placement of it. Sometimes when you get into your darker tones, you're a little bit more careful about, you know, you don't want to take that rich cocoa and just go like that, you know. But you can pretty much do whatever you want with when you work with these really light tones like this. You can do this on matte paper, but it's just going to be absorbing your color, your ink, a little bit faster, or a lot faster, depending on the paper. So you just kind of stay in a little area longer. I mean, this is just some copy paper right here, right? Completely absorbent, and it's not coated or anything like cardstock, but you can see I can get a nice soft application of that tone right on there, right? So if I can do it on that paper, you know, you can do it on, you know, better paper for sure. You just have to kind of stay with it a little bit longer. It has a different feel to it because it's matte, and that's not going to look glossy, you know, by doing this. Okay, here's Potter's Clay. So let's move into that color. That was the color that I stamped my mountains in, okay? So this should start to bring the scene together a little bit more, being that I'm using a color that I stamp my imagery in, okay? It's going into the mid-tones, so we have to be a little bit more careful about our application, okay? And again, I don't want to have like a, you know, something that looks like that, so just don't work in that kind of fashion, you know, just use a light touch, you know, and get the feel of it. See, I'm kind of bringing some of this color, this down into this water, and that's also the color that I stamped out that shimmering image in as well. So then how it kind of starts to bring together your different imagery now. because we're starting to get into the color that we stamped the images out in, which means that's the light that's reflecting off of that image. And in theory, kind of bouncing back to your eye if we were out, you know, looking at something. This is just kind of the depiction of it, of course, in stamping form. I have this cheap applicator right here, right? And look at, I used it, you know, for black before. So you can do this. It's just take it, you know, one ink at a time, so to speak, literally. Alright, so kind of blending that in, like so. I'm going to kind of make my perimeters a little bit darker. I like to contain my compositions where it looks like, you know, kind of a world unto itself, so I like to add a nice strong vignette to the pieces. Okay. Alright, so that is that. Let's try some sweet plum here. We didn't use that color, you know, for our imagery, but it can be within the color scheme. You can have other colors within the color scheme. Pink would look good in this, yellow, something like that. Okay, so when I just use that same part of my paper towel applicator here, you're mixing to form some fusion of sweet plum and potter's clay, and then, of course it'll have a little bit of the tea dye and desert sand that we used before too. Anytime you change colors, always kind of just use it in a small section, see if you like it. In this case, it doesn't read really as sweet plum. It's adding a different look to that color by blending into it. Okay, I think it looks pretty good. Sweet plum, it's kind of cooling down the scene a little bit, I think. I think it looks pretty good though still. Okay, kind of a strong vignette around the perimeter. I like to add darker tones in the shadow areas, okay? Alright. There we have that. Alright. I always love it when I finally get back to my original darkest impression color, okay? So we're now on the rich cocoa. This paper towel is starting to really shred, so let's see if I can get another color application here, which will be our final one. I can put in some black too, but let's go with this one as far as the colors go. Alright, can you see that? Where it's a little bit darker there. Alright. I can definitely tell it's quite a bit darker than the previous two colors. Memento inks are really slick. You can mix and match, you know, your brands of inks, okay? These are just dye-based inks that we're working in, so it's not brand of ink specific. A lot of times when people think landscape stamping or something like that, they don't think this with other types of or genres of ink. I mean, if you buy a stamp that says Happy Birthday, we're not thinking, okay, well, what paper do you have to use that in, and what brand of ink and what color of ink do you have to stamp that in? And that's no different for any type of scenic stamping imagery. You can finish these off in various ways. And pastels and colored pencils and watercolors and embossed, you know, and just with whatever type of look you're going to do, you would use, you know, the right paper to go along with that. So if you're using soft media like pastels, chalks, and colored pencils, then you'd probably be best off using a matte surface for the most part. Not exactly, but something like this, you know, you could use alcohol markers on it. On glossy cardstock, you can use alcohol markers on matte cardstocks. People think, oh, you have to use Yupo paper or something like that, which would be fantastic for that, but you really don't have to. You know, I've done alcohol markers just fine on glossy cardstock. On vellums, I used to play around with that back when I was in my kind of college years. Okay, that's all I needed with the rich cocoa, but you can kind of see where this is coming together. Alright, now we haven't used black at all yet, so let's go into some of that. Okay, before I do that, since I am using black imagery, let's use some of that black on my toning process here, okay? I thought, okay, let's do that before I go for these impressions, because I want these impressions to be nice and crisp, so the page is getting fairly wet at this point in time. I like to use Marvy inks in conjunction with my other brands of inks because they penetrate the surface really well after you get your thicker coats down, but it just comes to show you can use whatever brand you want. I don't know what brand of paper towel this is. Sometimes people will ask me about that type of thing. That is not specific to this technique either, or particular to this technique. I probably wouldn't use a paper towel that's going to shred too much, I mean, you know, in their first color or something like that, so I mean, you can probably do this with a napkin if you wanted to. Okay, coming together. Alright. So see that right there? See how it really recedes in the distance? Having that mountain and that tone instead of in black. If it's in black, it looks pretty good too. It just comes a little bit closer to us visually. Alright, so adding this stronger vignette down here. I know that the imagery, when stamped down here, it might get, you know, fairly dark in value, so let's kind of have that merge into this background, or the scene a little bit more. Okay, so I haven't unpacked my other pads yet, but I would, if I had all my pads out, I would use my VersaVine, I believe, for this foreground in here, but I'm just going to use this Memories Black. This Memories Black was one that I did a video for. It was like this unboxing of this, I'm guessing a 15-year-old pad. It was brand new. Or, I don't know, unwrapping, I guess, not unboxing, but I found it up on my shelf here, you know, hiding in plain sight type of thing, but this pad is no longer glued down, but still had the ink on here. It's not as wet as it would be as if it were brand new, so I mean, it's just recently opened, but it's, you know, it's still fairly juicy. It's not as juicy as it would have been if it was brand new, though, not, you know, 15 years old or whatever it is. I don't know when I bought it, but it was a long time. Okay, so I'm holding this down a little bit longer because the surface of this is a little bit moist. It's not going to wipe, you know, it's not like sopping wet or anything like that, but just the pulp of the paper is a little bit more moist, so I'm going to hold this down a little bit longer for that ink to transfer. Otherwise, when you're stamping wet into moist, sometimes you pull it off and you know, you lift your image, and like a vacuum, it, you know, that ink that you've applied to the stamp just comes right off. Alright, so anyway. Alright, so that, to me, looks like it is quite a bit in the foreground because it is so much darker than our background imagery, okay? Now you can do foreground in this one too. You can stamp this tree out in, like, say, a rich cocoa, and then, you know, go with another impression out here. Maybe I'll do something like that. So we can go multi-toned right in the foreground, okay? I've seen some really amazing things being done with this oak branch recently in the Facebook group. There have been some things done recently too, where I can barely recognize some of the stamps that are being used because they're just being used so kind of freely and in layers. It's really quite amazing and really fun to see. I'd recommend to you all, if you have a Facebook account, to join the Stampscapes 2 Facebook group and really see some amazing work being done. Okay, so I'm stamping this one out in rich cocoa. It might have had a little bit of black on it still, but it'll have some kind of fusion of those two inks on here. Okay. Okay, so you can see that. Sorry. There we go. It's stamped out a little bit lighter in the background. So you have this kind of multi-toned and depth foreground right in here. Okay, so we can do something again up here. Let's hit that with a... Which one of these is... Oops, there goes my pad right here. Don't look down on memories. This, like I said, this is like 15 years old, so if there's some kind of delamination, I don't know. I don't blame them. That's a long time for some ink to be sitting in a pad like that. And memories is it's a good strong black dye-based ink, so always appreciated having you know, that quality of ink. Okay, so there is that overhanging branch. Okay, but let's create a little bit more depth up there. Okay, let's go with that about like so. I gotta change my angle a little bit. Or a lot. I mean, I could use this back portion of it right here too. Okay, so we have that darker version up there, and also the lighter version within that same space. Okay, so that being said, let's go with this image right here. Now, in theory, he would probably be stamped out in like a lighter brown, but because this little fisherman is going to be the subject matter of the scene, I think I'm going to stamp it darker. Okay, so I'm going to use the memories black. It'll become really the focal point. We can just leave this as is, but let's go ahead and put this guy in there. Plop it right down here in the foreground. I guess it's not the foreground, but I don't know. You can call that space the foreground, you know, like 5 feet to 40 feet or something like that. I don't know, whatever it might be. Alright, so anyways, we have a lot of depth in here. And, you know, having things stamped out in color represents, you know, the color of light within a piece. And let's wait for this to dry off a little bit, and we'll have a lot of fun with some pigment ink in here. And it's really going to kind of expand on this whole idea of scenic lighting in here, and we'll change some textures around and manipulate the objects even further to create a strong depiction of light and thus mood within your scene. Alright, so I'm going to give this a little bit of time to dry, and I will get... Okay, we've given this a few minutes to dry, and me take a look. I just want to take a look in here and make sure that there's no puddling. Sometimes the memory ink is all... The memory's dye-based ink, it's almost like a pigment ink to me sometimes. It's almost kind of raised, so I have to make sure that there's no puddling on here. And it kind of leaves this a little bit of a residue. I am getting some black off on my finger here, so I am going to be a little bit careful with this next step that I do, which is just taking a cotton ball here now and some white pigment ink. All right, and what we're going to do is we're going to kind of accentuate the light areas of the scene. So wherever I've retained some of the white of the paper, okay. Well, in here it'll be at the base of this. There's not really white at the base of this, but you'll see where this comes into play. This should add in kind of this, oh, I don't know, this little kind of a spirit of kind of reflected sediment in the air, be it moisture, dust, whatever, okay? So I'm kind of really blotting this off. I don't know how much ink is on. I think this is my re-inked frost white pigment ink right here. All right, I know this is kind of fraying a little bit too, so let me see if I can kind of get that smashed down a little bit more. Okay, so where this really looks good is where light meets dark, okay? And what's happening here? There we go, okay. Let's really get this kind of tapped down lightly. What you want is a dry brush application of this. So you really want to blot this off a lot before you apply it in here. And when you start applying it in here, you want it to be where just a light touch is barely kind of noticeable. Okay, and it's only through this kind of repetition of application of a very light, dry amount of that pigment ink on there does it really start to influence what we see. So you can see it kind of putting it over those trees. It kind of puts this light kind of, you know, meandering through those trees. You know, those trees right up here are the same color as, you know, the bottom of them, or these ones out here. But you add that in there and it kind of creates this kind of light flooding through. We're aware of this kind of light and how it's kind of influencing our objects in here. I believe it kind of creates a little bit more depth as well, like that. Okay? And in being aware of lighting, okay, as opposed to thinking of objects, I believe it kind of creates a stronger kind of emotional feel to our overall scene. Okay, so see it kind of coming through there. That light is like flooding through the canyon, reflecting off the canyon walls there. Let's put it a little bit up in these tree branches as well, okay? So it'll vary our foreground. So not only is it influencing the background objects, but it's influencing the foreground as well. So we have this light kind of permeating all distances within the piece, okay? See that right in there, how it kind of affects those trees up there, those overhanging tree limbs. Don't do it over everything. Don't, you know, just plaster the whole thing, otherwise we don't have this kind of oscillation of crisp and light. You don't want to put it over here because you're saying that this area is in shadow, so you wouldn't have light reflecting off of those areas. But see right down here where light meets dark in that little water area. We can put some down here and say that there's a little bit of a kind of a mist or fog on the lake. And it kind of creates that softer type of look right down in there. Do you see the difference between that little area now? Let's take a look at this right in here, okay? I mean, it looks fine as is, but let's take a look at what this little touch can do, okay? Watch this right here, okay? If I do it once, there's nothing, okay? There's no change at all, but only through kind of this repetition. I'm just trying to really emphasize just how light and dry this ink is on here, okay? See that on that boat right there? See, as I kind of put a little bit at the base of the boat, like that, it kind of creates this little bit of a transition from light to dark like that. So it kind of puts this low line fog. I need a little bit more, once in a while we need to, re-ink here. But then just kind of starting your lighter areas again, and see that? It puts that character in illuminated, in an illuminated area. See that right there? And it makes it a little bit softer down there. It doesn't have a different feel. See these trees around here? Let's put a little bit on those tree limbs, and it'll look like lighted. Let's do a little bit right here where I stamped out that oak branch limb lighter. Let's put a little bit of white pigment ink on it to make it look like that light is really influencing that object. Okay? So see how it's changed texturally within this piece. It's like dry brushing. I don't know. That's what I call it here. Dry cotton balling. I don't know, that sounds really weird. Okay, so I can add a little bit more, the lighter you want it to be. Just add more. Just kind of layer it. Most pigment inks, what I found, is they dry darker. It looks lighter when you apply it than as it dries. I don't know, it becomes a little bit more transparent for some reason. And so I would say use a little bit more than what you think looks ideal, because when it dries, I don't know, the inks, that you have, behind it will show through a little bit more. But look at that light kind of really coming through that. It has a different kind of emotional quality now, to my eye, than it did without it. So from a textural standpoint and from a lighting standpoint, it all adds up to kind of a different emotional standpoint. Okay, so that is really fun there. Let me see if this white pen, okay, this white pen's working great. Let's come into this right here and see these windows in this cabin right here. The cabin, I didn't work around them, when I was toning in, but they did get dark, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring that lightness out again in that space with a white gel pen. Okay, so it's a little bit lighter in that cabin, in the window, and there's this reflection that I've drawn into the design, so I can put a little bit of that reflected light down in here. Okay, now, on the design itself, this is what you do, where you can see these little lighter areas in the design. You can see where there's shadows at the base of these rocks, right? But then I have the highlights on the tops of it, because I've made my images in the Stampscapes line, I've made them tonal, okay, as opposed to linear, so you can put a little bit more shadows at the base of things, and on the tops of things, where there's highlights, you just reiterate it like this. A little bit of a white gel pen or whatever. And now those rocks are reflecting the light a little bit more from, being top lit. Okay? Now we have that reflection on those rocks. Why not put some of that reflected light down in the water so you can make your water really shimmer a little bit by putting in these reflections down here. Everyone loves kind of the look of sparkling water. So we have those little striations in there from the shimmering stamp, and you just go in there and you put a little bit of a white line right over the top of them, because that little, you know, these right here represent the shadows, the darker things. So if there's a shadow to it, you can also put a highlight. So you can use the imagery itself and take your cues from images and how they've been drawn to answer where you create your shadows. There's shadows in the designs, so you can just kind of darken them a little bit. And again, you put your highlights in the lit areas. Alright, now I'm finding that it's hard to apply this where I've already applied the pigment ink, because it's like drawing into kind of a wet paint. And gel pens can't do that very easily, so I'll stick to my areas where there isn't too much pigment ink laid down. Okay, and some of these trees up here, I can put a few little highlights on some of my trees. In the form of these little dots. It's kind of making these little tree limbs come alive. Put some on my mountain. Reiterating that lighting direction and whatnot. Okay, the light is coming from in here, so maybe on the sides of some of these rock textures I can put some of those highlights down. It isn't a perfect science. I mean, I'm just kind of adding it around here and there. I'm putting more in the light areas than the dark, of course, because that's where the highlights would be, where light is hitting the mountain. See that right in there? This kind of area got a little bit darker, so I'm putting the highlights up there. There's some along the rocks right here. You can go for a little bit texture too, like this. So lighting is really fun. It's kind of, I don't know, landscape painters, sometimes they, like the Impressionists for sure, it's like you're painting light more than the object. So instead of thinking, like an oak branch here, you're thinking about the light being reflected off of that. So you're trying to do a depiction of that lighting as opposed to thinking object. It's a little bit of a different mindset, but this is just an easy way to do it. You're just stamping out whatever your color scheme is, and you decide that ahead of time. Just stamp out your imagery in those colors, okay? As opposed to just all black or something like that. Alright, so anyway, there you have it. A fairly easy way to really depict light. Alright, so here's the differences. This is what people tend to look at and say, oh my god, this is a hard process, okay? I could have stamped this in black, and this in black right here, that in black, okay? And just colored it in, okay? That's a good way to work, and that scene would look fine. It would just look very different, okay? But that's what we want out of our stamps. We want to get a lot of mileage, and we want to have options, when we're stamping these things out. I think you get your money's worth, more for your money that way, when you can create all kinds of different looks using your existing imagery, okay? This is just a different way to use things a little bit more strategically. Alright, so, again, just to reiterate, things in the distance. Let's take a look at our color scheme, alright? Let's lay this thing out from dark to light. Okay. No, I did use the tea dye in here as well, so that's something like this. So, anyways, here's the black. Alright. So just think of it like this, okay? You line them up from light to dark, okay? Dark is close, all right? And then as you move farther away, it gets a little bit lighter, and then lightest right here. Now, if I was, I don't know, if I had multiple layers of trees or something like that, then maybe I would have gone with, I don't know, this, and then this, in my next tone or something like that. You can manipulate things around too. Let's say another thing that could have worked in here, that's just fine. This is close, and this could be my midground or whatever. But then, if I didn't want those mountains in one of these tones, what you could do is you can just ink it up with this color and then blot it down first and then stamp it back there, so it would be a lighter version of that brown. Okay, so there's all kinds of different ways you can work, but the bottom line is the things that are kind of the farthest away from us visually, you just stamp them in a lighter value. All right, the things that are closer to us are stamped in a darker value, so you go near to far like that. And then when you start bringing in these tones into your scene, you have to kind of get back to the tone, the darkest of tones that you've used in here, for everything to kind of make sense. If you just stamp out, your near, midground, far in these colors right here, it does look weird, but it's because we haven't brought in our different tones and shadows into that, using that color scheme right there. So only when you get back to that one does it kind of really bring it together. In this one right here, I felt that the black really brought it together, so you have to kind of work through that entire color scheme. But look at the benefit of it in terms of the depiction of light. It really pays dividends, okay? And then if you want to use your, your white pigment ink in there to depict light, you just remember to retain some white of your cardstock, Don't tone everything out using colors, okay? Because what we're saying is that there's, still some white light in here, which would be the white of the paper, and you can utilize that white pigment ink in here to depict kind of light, that same light coming from the background or wherever it might be, permeating the rest of the scene. So it looks like this, you're being flooded in light or whatever, and this little figure in here, they're now encompassed by a lot of this light, because that light from the background is illuminating this so-called, moisture in the air, whatever, and it's making it look like fog. So anyways, an easy way to work. Hope you try it out. It's really a fun way to do it. Maybe try it with something very simple. Not that this was complex or anything like that, but, light blue, medium blue, darker blue, okay? Far, closer, closest. Well, black would really be the closest thing, but I don't know, just something like that. And just go in there and start blending in those tones. When you come in with the first color, it's not going to bring it all together. You have to work through all those different tones, but just let it develop slowly, and remember to retain your areas of light in there if you want to use some of that pigment. I can't emphasize that enough, and that's what I always tell people, like at the demonstrations these past couple weekends. A lot of times people get, into their scenes, and if they ever say, they say to me sometimes, like, I'm really having a hard time with lighting, it's because they've taken their tones and they've colored everything out. Okay, so in here, they would take that brown, it would be in this whole area. Just leave some areas in here. Darker tones kind of stay around on the perimeter more. The lighter tones go in here the farthest, most amount of coverage. Medium tones get a little bit, less of, there's less of an application than the darkest of tones. You can see it right here. They're kind of on this perimeter right here. All right, so anyways, hope you have fun with that concept there. Hope you employ it in your scenes in some way. It could just be in a very simple, manner of something darker and lighter in the foreground like that. But it's a lot of fun, and I think the results can really kind of expand on your kind of knowledge and, sensitivity towards scenic lighting. Okay, so anyways, thanks for watching as always.